In the quiet town of Maplewood, where autumn leaves painted the streets in warm amber hues, lived a woman named Elara Winters. At 35, she had the kind of smile that made everyone feel like they'd known her forever. Her apartment above the town's only bookstore was a sanctuary of plants, books, and soft music, a reflection of her gentle soul. But it was her profession that made Elara truly special. She owned a small salon called Restful Roots tucked away on a side street where the town's hustle seemed to fade into whispers. Unlike other salons with their bright lights and constant chatter, Elara's place felt like stepping into a secret garden. The walls were painted a soft sage green, and the air always smelled of lavender and rosemary. What made her salon truly unusual wasn't its decor, though. It was what happened when Elara touched her client's hair. Without fail, within minutes of her fingers working through their locks, they would drift into the most peaceful sleep they'd ever experienced. They'd wake feeling refreshed, renewed, as if they'd slept for days rather than minutes. The townspeople joked about it. Elara's magic hands, they'd say with a laugh. Better than any sleeping pill, some clients came just for that, a brief escape from insomnia or anxiety. Mothers brought their colicky babies. Stressed executives scheduled appointments before important meetings. Elara never advertised this side effect of her services, but word had spread through Maplewood and beyond. What none of them knew was why this happened. They didn't know what Elara saw when they drifted off, what she felt as her fingers worked through their hair. They didn't know the price she paid for each moment of peace she gave them. If only they knew why they slept off whenever she touched their hair. This is her story. Elara hadn't always been a hairdresser. Once, she'd been a promising neurologist at a prestigious hospital in the city. Her colleagues had marveled at her intuitive understanding of the brain, her almost supernatural ability to diagnose conditions others missed. Patients requested her specifically, claiming that even her initial examinations left them feeling better somehow. But that was before the accident, before her husband Daniel and their 5-year-old daughter Lily had been taken from her in a single rainy night. Before the grief had awakened something in her that she couldn't explain or control. The night it happened, Elara had been working late at the hospital. Daniel had picked up Lily from her dance class, and they were heading home when a truck skidded on the wet road. The police said they died instantly, a small mercy, they called it. Elara didn't feel merciful when she collapsed in the hospital corridor, her white coat suddenly feeling like a mockery of her inability to save the ones she loved most. For months afterward, she couldn't sleep. Her mind, her brilliant, analytical mind that could map neural pathways and recite obscure medical journals, became her enemy, replaying the accident she hadn't witnessed but could imagine in excruciating detail. She took leave from the hospital, then eventually resigned. She couldn't bear to look at patients anymore, not when she couldn't heal herself. It was during this darkest period that Elara discovered her gift, though she wouldn't call it that for years. Her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Chen, had fallen ill with a high fever. With no family nearby, Elara had gone to check on her, driven by some remnant of her medical instinct. "Your hands," Mrs. Chen had murmured deliriously as Elara checked her temperature. "So cool, so nice." Instinctively, Elara had stroked the old woman's thin white hair away from her burning forehead, and then something strange happened. As her fingers moved through Mrs. Chen's hair, Elara began to see flashes of memories of young Mrs. Chen running through rice fields, her wedding day, the birth of her son, and deeper pain leaving her homeland, losing her husband, her son moving away. More surprisingly, Elara felt her own grief momentarily lifting, as if flowing out through her fingertips. Mrs. Chen had fallen into a deep, peaceful sleep, her fever breaking overnight. It happened again when Elara helped a friend's child who had been having terrible nightmares. One stroke of the girl's hair, and Elara could see the monsters that haunted her dreams. The child fell asleep instantly and woke without fear for the first time in weeks. These experiences frightened Elara at first. She consulted neurologists, psychologists, even a reluctant visit to a woman who claimed psychic abilities. No one could explain what was happening, though the psychic had looked at her with unnerving intensity and said, "Some wounds create doorways." Eventually, Elara left the city and her old life behind. She moved to Maplewood, took classes in cosmetology, something so different from neurology that it felt like reinvention, and opened Restful Roots. She told herself she was starting over, but in truth, she was testing her strange ability in a controlled environment. What she discovered over time was both wondrous and terrible. When people slept under her touch, Elara could see their deepest pains, their core wounds, the memories they'd buried deep. More than that, she could temporarily take those burdens from them, absorb a fraction of their suffering into herself, giving them a respite they desperately needed. The cost was high. After a day of clients, Elara would return to her apartment physically drained, her mind crowded with fragments of others' traumas. She'd developed techniques to cope: meditation, journaling, long walks in the forest outside town, but some nights she still woke screaming from nightmares that weren't hers. Yet she couldn't stop. In helping others find peace, she had found purpose. It wasn't the same as saving lives in an emergency room, but sometimes, when she saw the tension leave a client's face, when they returned weeks later looking lighter, healing in ways they couldn't articulate, she thought perhaps this was its own kind of medicine. What she never told anyone was that she was searching too. In every client's memories, in every burden she shouldered temporarily, she looked for something that might help her understand her own gift, and perhaps, finally, heal her own shattered heart. Tuesday mornings were usually quiet at Restful Roots. Elara used the time to order supplies, arrange appointments, and prepare herself mentally for the week ahead. But this particular Tuesday, the bell above the door jingled unexpectedly, bringing with it a gust of autumn air and a man Elara had never seen before. He was tall, with salt and pepper hair that looked like it hadn't been cut in months. Deep lines framed eyes that might have been kind once but now held a wariness that Elara recognized immediately, the look of someone carrying too much for too long. "I don't have any openings today," she said gently, already reaching for her appointment book, although she knew it by heart. "But I could fit you in tomorrow afternoon." The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked around the salon with the focused attention of someone committing details to memory. "My sister sent me," he finally said. "Marian Reeves. She said you helped her." Elara remembered Marian, a kindergarten teacher with chronic migraines that disappeared after 3 sessions at Restful Roots. But there had been more. Behind Marian's migraines lay the memory of finding her mother after a suicide attempt 20 years earlier, a trauma she'd never properly processed. "Marian is lovely," Elara said carefully. "What kind of service are you looking for, Mr. Thorne?" "Dr. James Thorne." He paused. "And I'm not entirely sure. Marian was rather enigmatic. She just said I should come see you, that you might be able to help with my insomnia." The hesitation before insomnia told Elara there was more to the story. There always was. "I'm a hairdresser, Dr. Thorne, not a sleep specialist," she said with a small smile. "And I'm a scientist, Ms. Winters, not someone who typically puts much stock in alternative treatments. Yet here I am." He ran a hand through his unkempt hair. "Desperation makes believers of us all, I suppose." Something in his directness appealed to her. "I have a cancellation tomorrow at 2. A haircut might not cure insomnia, but it couldn't hurt your appearance in the meantime." For the first time, a glimmer of humor crossed his face. "Are you suggesting I look disreputable, Ms. Winters?" "Professional observation only," she replied, writing his name in her book. After he left, Elara found herself unusually curious about this new client. Something about him had set off alarm bells in her mind, not of danger, but of significance. She'd learned to trust these intuitions over the years. The next day, James arrived precisely at 2, looking marginally more put together in a blue button-down shirt that brought out the color of his eyes. As Elara draped him with the cape and guided him to the washing station, she noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself as if braced for impact. "Just relax," she murmured, adjusting the water temperature. "This is the best part." "I doubt I'll relax," he said. "But I appreciate the optimism." As her fingers worked shampoo into his hair, she felt the familiar shift in her consciousness that preceded a connection. Her hands tingled, and the salon around her seemed to recede slightly, like a camera pulling focus. Just before his eyes drifted closed the moment they always did, James looked directly at her in the mirror above the sink. "You're doing something," he whispered. "I can feel it." Then his eyes shut, and Elara was pulled into the torrent of his memories. She saw James as a boy, following an older girl, Marian, through woodland paths, collecting interesting rocks and leaves. She saw him hunched over textbooks, flourishing in the world of molecules and equations where everything followed logical rules. She saw his marriage to a woman with kind eyes and a quick laugh, the birth of their son, academic success, ordinary happiness. Then came the shadows: his wife's diagnosis, early-onset Alzheimer's at just 39. The brutal progression of the disease. James's increasingly desperate research, late nights in the lab searching for anything that might slow her decline. The clinical trials that failed. His son's resentment at being sidelined during his mother's illness. The funeral, attended by colleagues who murmured about dedication to science while avoiding the truth that James had failed the person he loved most. Deeper still lay his current work, a research project investigating cellular regeneration in the brain, something proprietary, something that consumed him, something that was failing, despite promising early results. The weight of his grief and obsession hit Elara like a physical blow. This was heavier than most burdens she encountered, dense with scientific knowledge she couldn't fully comprehend and emotional pain she understood all too well. As she absorbed a fraction of it, giving him temporary relief, she felt her own knees weaken. When James awoke 40 minutes later, his hair neatly trimmed, he looked disoriented. "I fell asleep," he said, sounding accusatory. "It happens sometimes," Elara replied, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "Something about the scalp massage relaxes people." He studied her face. "You look pale, just a bit tired today." As he paid, he hesitated. "I haven't slept that deeply in years. Not since before Catherine got sick." Elara pretended not to notice the significance of his admission. "I'm glad you got some rest." "What did you do to me?" he asked bluntly. "Just a haircut, Dr. Thorne." He didn't believe her, she could see it in his eyes, but he left without pressing further. That night, Elara dreamed of molecular structures and brain scans. She woke with a pounding headache and the unsettling feeling that James Thorne's appearance in her life was not coincidental. Her intuition proved correct when he returned a week later, without an appointment, looking both determined and slightly embarrassed. "I've been sleeping better since I saw you," he said without preamble, "and I want to know why." Elara gestured to a chair. "Perhaps you just needed a good haircut." "Please don't insult my intelligence," he said, remaining standing. "Something happened while I was in that chair. I'm a scientist, Ms. Winters. I observe. I analyze. And what I experience goes beyond relaxation techniques or placebo effect." "What exactly do you think happened?" she asked, her heart beating faster. "I don't know," he admitted. "But since that day, the noise in my head, the constant replay of failures and regrets, it's quieter. And I dreamed of Catherine without waking up in panic. That hasn't happened in 3 years." Elara considered her options. She'd never told anyone about her ability, not fully. But looking at James, the haunted determination in his eyes, the desperation beneath his scientific curiosity, she made a decision. "I can't explain it scientifically," she said slowly. "But when people fall asleep while I'm touching their hair, I can see their memories specifically, the painful ones. And I can take some of that pain, temporarily." She expected disbelief, perhaps mockery. Instead, James sat down heavily, his expression intent. "Show me," he said. "I don't think you understand what you're asking," Elara said, unnerved by his immediate acceptance of something that defied rational explanation. "This isn't a party trick." "I'm not treating it as one," James replied. "If what you're describing is real, and I have reason to believe it might be, then it has profound implications for my research." "Your research into brain regeneration," she said without thinking. James went very still. "How do you know about that?" Elara realized her mistake. "When I see memories, sometimes I pick up fragments of knowledge, current preoccupations. It's not mind reading, just impressions." He leaned forward. "What else did you see?" "Your wife, Catherine. Your son. Your sister as a child," she hesitated. "Your feelings of failure." A muscle in his jaw tightened. "And you took some of this emotional pain, as a fraction of it. It's temporary, like borrowing a burden so someone can rest. Eventually it dissipates, but sometimes that brief respite allows real healing to begin. What happens to you in the process?" The question surprised her. Few people ever considered the cost to her. "I get tired. Sometimes I have dreams or headaches. It depends on the person and the weight they're carrying." James was silent for a long moment, his scientist's mind visibly working through possibilities. There have been studies on emotional contagion, mirror neurons, even quantum entanglement theories of consciousness, but nothing that would explain what you're describing. Unless he trailed off, then refocused, would you be willing to let me run some tests? Tests, non-invasive neuroimaging. EEG readings while you're using your ability. Perhaps blood work to check for fluctuations in certain neurotransmitters or hormones. Elara felt a chill. You want to turn me into a research subject? I want to understand, he corrected, both as a scientist and as someone who has spent the last 5 years searching for anything that might help people with neurological trauma. And if you found a scientific explanation, what then? Then maybe we could help more people. Maybe we could replicate the effect or enhance it. His expression softened. I watched my wife lose herself piece by piece, memory by memory. If there's even a chance that what you do could lead to a breakthrough in how we treat brain injuries or disease. I'm not interested in becoming a lab specimen, Elara interrupted. I've spent years learning to manage this gift on my own terms, even if it could help others who are suffering. The question hit her like a physical blow. She thought of Daniel and Lily, of how helpless she'd felt in her grief. Hadn't she become a doctor in the first place to alleviate suffering? I need time to think, she said finally. James nodded and stood to leave, but paused at the door. One more question, if I may. Does it always work? Your ability. Almost always. Have you ever encountered someone you couldn't help? Elara thought of the few clients whose pain had been too deep, too complex for her to access. Yes, some wounds are buried too deeply or protected too fiercely. And have you ever been able to do more than temporarily relieve someone's burden? Have you ever permanently healed someone? She hesitated, then admitted the truth that had been haunting her for years. No, never. No matter how much of their pain I take, there's always more. The human capacity for suffering seems endless. As does our capacity for resilience, James added quietly. Think about my offer, Elara, please. After he left, Elara cancelled her remaining appointments and closed the salon early. She needed to clear her head. She drove to the small lake outside town, where she often went to release the emotional residue from her work. The autumn air was crisp, leaves crunching beneath her feet as she followed the familiar path to her favorite viewing spot. Sitting on a fallen log, she watched the late afternoon sun dancing on the water's surface and tried to make sense of her encounter with James. For years she'd kept her ability secret, using it quietly to offer temporary relief while searching for her own healing. The idea of subjecting it to scientific scrutiny terrified her. What if they discovered something was wrong with her brain? What if they wanted to exploit her ability? What if they found nothing at all and dismissed her experience as delusion? Yet something about James's quest resonated with her. She remembered the crushing weight of her own grief after losing Daniel and Lily, the desperate wish for anyone who could lift that burden even momentarily. If her strange gift could somehow be understood, perhaps even replicated or developed into a treatment. Her thoughts were interrupted by the buzzing of her phone. An unknown number. MS Winters? This is Riverside Hospital. We have a Dr. James Thorne here in our emergency department. You're listed as his emergency contact in his phone. Elara's heart raced. Is he all right? He collapsed in his laboratory. He's stable but unresponsive. The doctors are running tests, but they've found no obvious cause for his condition. I'll be right there. The drive to the hospital was a blur. When she arrived, a nurse led her to a small private room where James lay connected to monitors, his eyes closed, his breathing steady. Are you family? The doctor asked when she entered. A friend, Elara replied, unable to take her eyes off James's still form. What happened? We're not sure. His lab assistant found him unconscious at his desk. All his vital signs are normal. Brain activity shows typical sleep patterns, but we can't wake him. Like a coma. This looks more like exceptionally deep sleep, but without any obvious cause. No head injury, no stroke, toxicology is clean. The doctor hesitated. His assistant mentioned he'd been working obsessively on some new research avenue, something about emotional transference and neural pathways. Does that mean anything to you? No, she lied. May I have a moment with him? She moved to James's bedside and gently took his hand. "What were you doing, James?" she whispered. His hair, bracing herself for the familiar sensation of connecting to his consciousness. Nothing happened. She tried again, focusing harder, but the doorway remained closed. Bandage on his forearm. Carefully peeling it back, she found a fresh injection site. James had done something to himself, some experiment related to her ability, and now he was trapped in a sleep she couldn't reach. Both terror and determination. If science had created this situation, perhaps science could solve it, but she would need help and access to James's research. She found his phone and, using his unconscious thumbprint, unlocked it. She found his lab assistant's contact and made the call that would change everything. Morgan Chen, James's research assistant, met Elara in the hospital cafeteria. She was younger than Elara had expected, barely out of graduate school by the look of her, with intelligent eyes magnified by round glasses and an air of barely contained panic. Acting strangely for weeks, Morgan said after introductions. "Ever since he met you, actually." "Anything to do with me?" Elara asked, though she already knew the answer. And opened a file. "Because he's been researching you. Or rather, researching what he thinks you can do." She turned the screen toward Elara, showing a complex diagram of neural pathways with annotations in James's handwriting. He said he'd found someone with the ability to absorb emotional trauma through some kind of psychoneurological connection. We all thought he was working too hard, maybe having a breakdown. "Sure," Elara said quietly. Penetrating. "Are you saying it's true? You can do what he claims?" Breath. "I don't know what he claims exactly, but yes, I have an ability that allows me to temporarily ease people's emotional burdens when they fall asleep during hair treatments." She didn't immediately dismiss this. Instead, she pulled up another file. "Then you need to see this. Dr. Thorne was developing a serum based on his observations of your presumed neurochemical state during these episodes. He believed if he could replicate it, he might be able to create a treatment for PTSD, complicated grief, even certain memory-related aspects of degenerative diseases." "What I do naturally," Elara murmured, the implications dawning on her. Something went wrong. The last entry in his research notes indicates he was going to self-administer a preliminary version. He thought it might allow him to access and process his own trauma regarding his wife's death. Trapped him in that trauma, Elara concluded. He's not in a normal sleep state, he's locked in his own painful memories with no way out. But nodded. "If that's true, how do we help him?" "I need to see his lab, his research. Maybe there's an antidote or a reversal agent he created." "Exactly. I've been through everything. This was experimental, preliminary. He wasn't supposed to test it yet." Another way, Elara stood. "I need to try to reach him." Elara explained her plan to Morgan. "Usually I can access people's memories when they're in a sleep state while I'm touching their hair. It creates a connection that allows me to temporarily take on some of their emotional burden." "Possible," Morgan said, but her tone lacked conviction. "Current condition, according to his doctors," Elara countered. "I think the serum he created was trying to artificially induce the state that allows me to make these connections. But without the ability to control it or end it, he's trapped. Establish a connection while he's in this state. Maybe I can find him in there and help him find his way out." Then nodded. "What do you need from me?" "If either of us shows signs of distress, get the doctors." To James's bedside and gently placed her hands on his head. Closing her eyes, she focused in the way she'd learned over years of practice, seeking the familiar opening into another's consciousness. The same barrier she'd encountered earlier. But then, concentrating harder than she ever had before, she felt the faintest thread of connection. She followed it, pulling herself along its tenuous path, until suddenly she was no longer in the hospital room, but standing in a sterile laboratory. Frantically sorting through papers, muttering to himself. He didn't seem to notice her. Continued his agitated search. Abruptly, and they were in a hospital room different from the one his body currently occupied. A woman lay in the bed Catherine, Elara recognized from his memories. She was thin, confused, her once vibrant eyes cloudy with the fog of Alzheimer's. James was saying to her, "The solution. It has to be here somewhere, but I can't find it." "Some things can't be fixed, Jamie, not even by you." He snapped, then immediately looked remorseful. "I'm sorry, I just need more time." Now they were in a small apartment, and James was arguing with a young man who had his eyes his son. The young man accused, "You were always at the lab, and she needed you." And while she was still herself, "I needed you." Palpable, radiating from him in waves that Elara could feel physically. This was the core of his trauma, not just the loss of his wife, but his conviction that he had failed her and their son by retreating into his work instead of facing the reality of her decline. Most centered around Catherine's illness and death, James's research failures, the growing distance between him and his son. Elara realized that the serum had indeed trapped him in a loop of his most painful memories, forcing him to relive them without respite. Elara moved closer to him in each scene, trying to make him aware of her presence. Finally, in a memory of him sitting alone in his office late at night, staring at a photo of Catherine, she managed to touch his shoulder. Startled. "Elara, how are you here?" He said. "This isn't real, James. You're trapped in a memory loop induced by your serum." Disoriented. "It feels real. The guilt, the regret, it's overwhelming." "That's what you were trying to access, but you need to come back now." "I deserve this, to face what I've done, the time I wasted." "No one deserves to be trapped in their pain forever. Grief isn't punishment, James. It's the price of loving deeply." Surprising him, "You made mistakes, we all do, but punishing yourself won't change the past. It only steals your future and your chance to reconnect with your son." Work on in the real world, not here in these memories. Dawning understanding. "You're really here, aren't you? Using your ability to reach me. Like you did before." "Not all of it, and not permanently. But I can help lighten it enough for you to find your way back. The real healing will have to happen on the other side." Her hands on either side of his face. "Focus on my voice, on my touch. Feel the connection between us." Elara opened herself fully to his pain, the guilt, the regret, the crushing sense of failure. It flooded into her with an intensity that made her gasp, but she held firm, absorbing as much as she could bear while leaving him enough to find his own path to healing. A light. Even as she felt herself weakening under the weight of his burden. "I'll be right behind you." Effort, she pushed him toward the light, using the last of her strength to propel him back to consciousness. James's eyes flew open. He gasped, struggling to orient himself, while beside him, Elara collapsed. Elara woke to the steady beep of a heart monitor and the sensation of someone holding her hand. Opening her eyes, she found herself in a hospital bed with James sitting beside her, looking exhausted but very much awake. "How long was I out?" He helped her sip water from a cup with a straw. "The doctors couldn't find anything physically wrong with you. They called it extreme fatigue." She tried to sit up and winced. Every part of her felt heavy, weighted with the emotional burden she'd taken from James. Said simply, "Morgan told me what happened, what you tried to do, and I remember parts of it. You found me in there." Too tired for lengthy explanations. James continued, his voice thick with emotion. Is it permanent?" It never is. I just borrowed enough to help you find your way out. It will dissipate from me over time, and you'll have to face your own healing journey. Lighter. Respite is enough to give people a new perspective, a chance to see their pain not as something that defines them, but as something they can learn to carry differently. For a moment. The research I was doing, it was dangerous, reckless. Shortcut for healing. But what you showed me is that there aren't shortcuts. Real healing takes time, connection. He squeezed her hand. The things I failed to give Catherine and Michael. Elara said gently. He's coming to see me tomorrow. James's voice broke slightly. I don't know if he'll forgive me, but it's a start. Intently. What about you, Elara? You help everyone else with their burdens. Who helps you with yours? God. For years, she'd been so focused on managing her gift, on helping others find temporary peace, that she'd pushed aside her own healing. And Lily, she said quietly, what I didn't tell you is that I've never been able to use my ability on myself. I can see everyone's pain but my own. Of all healing we can often see more clearly for others than for ourselves. James hesitated. That's why we need each other. A doctor entered to check on Elara, followed closely by Morgan, who was carrying a thick file. And your research notes, Morgan told James after greeting Elara. Your theory about emotional transference has some validity, but the method was fundamentally flawed. Something that requires human connection, James said, glancing at Elara. I see that now. Elara asked. We have a proposition for you, James said. Not as a test subject, but as a collaborator. Your gift is extraordinary, but it comes at a great personal cost. What if we could develop a way to amplify the healing aspects while protecting you from taking on so much? Added, your intuitive understanding with our scientific approach. Offer. For years, she'd worked alone, carrying others' burdens in secret, searching for meaning in her strange ability. The idea of collaboration, of finding a way to help more people while protecting herself, was tempting. Salon, she said finally. It's not just a cover, it's the environment where I can best use my gift. People are vulnerable there, open in ways they aren't in clinical settings. Around your practice, James suggested. Minimal disruption, complete transparency. Elara felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope, not just for easing others suffering temporarily, but for finding a sustainable way to help and perhaps, finally, for addressing her own unhealed grief. Restful Roots had a new sign on the door: restorative therapy research project in collaboration with Riverside Neurological Institute. The clients still came for haircuts, still fell asleep under Elara's touch, but now they were offered the opportunity to participate in a study exploring emotional processing and trauma release.